The police force now has a multi-million-dollar crime center, a number of environmental bills debated in the House of Assembly, and airport authority workers to receive outstanding pay. Good evening, everyone. I'm Lissy Bastian with your Jcn News for this Wednesday, February 17th. Thanks for staying with us. The government continuing its mission to ensuring that law enforcement, particularly police officers, are meeting the on-hand challenges of a 21st century policing environment. Today, a multi-million-dollar real-time crime center, RTCC, was officially opened at the police headquarters on East Street. Our Laurencia Smith was at the opening and files this report.
Once again, the Royal Bahamas Police Force making strides in the world of technology on Wednesday, officially christening the real-time crime center. Prime Minister Dr. Hubert Minnis, National Security Minister Marvin Dames, Commissioner Paul Roll, and other officials on hand for the auspicious occasion.
Dr. Minnis in his remarks says the real-time crime center will maximize the likelihood that members of the Royal Bahamas Police Force can respond to crimes occurring in real time and doing so effectively.
The mission of the Real-Time Crime Center is to provide the police with the ability to capitalize on its wide and expanding range of technologies for efficient and effective policing. The technology can be used as evidence for investigative and prosecutorial purposes, as well as to provide feedback on best practices during evaluations and training.
The $20 million real-time crime center will serve as the home to the force's vast pool of technology resources such as closed-circuit television, CCTV, and Marco's Alert. It will also host officers who have been deployed to the police control room. Commissioner Roll describes the center as the brain of the force.
911, 919, the call comes in the room up there. The dispatcher will ask whether or not it is for fire, ambulance, or police, whatever that emergency is. If it's for EMS, notice you have 4 EMS dispatchers in there. One of them will take the line. We have 21 available lines. So 21 911 calls can be active at once. And if there's more than that, the call will then be routed to Freeport.
Now the force has already seen dividends from its investment with ShotSpotter, CCTV, body-worn, and dash cameras. Today, there have been several requests for footage, recording during police operation to bring transparency as it relates to complaints and corruptions, and has assisted with at least 2 homicide investigations. Minister James spoke more to how the technology has helped to improve law enforcement.
Last year, the Royal Bahamas Police Force recorded 1,052 gunshots. And out of that number, 463 or 44% was detected by ShotSpotter. And as a result of that, any number of persons were arrested or a crime prevented as a result.
There are currently over 500 CCTV cameras spread across the capital, with 75 specifically trained on crime hotspots. ShotSpotter, which has been in place since 2019, has recorded over thousands of gunshot incidents here in New Providence. I'm Laurencia Smith for Jcn News.
In news from Parliament, members of the lower chamber today debated the Biological Resources and Traditional Knowledge Bill 2021. This bill seeks to establish a regulatory permitting and revenue sharing regime with companies seeking to research and exploit the nation's marine genetic resources. Just last week, Environment and Housing Minister Ramal Ferreira introduced the bills, which he says seeks to prevent unfettered exploitation of the Bahamas' biological and genetic resources. Leading off debate this morning, the minister said this piece of legislation is perhaps one of the most significant that parliamentarians will ever table in the House of Assembly to govern the country's natural resources. He adds that beside food and recreational value, certain species in Bahamian waters have been recognized to have medicinal and pharmaceutical value.
Over the past decades, the waters of our country have been subject to a type of plundering by researchers engaged in what is termed bioprospecting to extract various resources found in our country. One very critical and important example of this that I'd like to bring to the fore of public attention is a species by the name of Antilogoria elizabethae, commonly known as the sea whip. The sea whip. This species is of significant economic potential and importance. Sea whip extractions consist of powerful healing ingredients. It's been found to have great medicinal and cosmetic benefits. The chemicals found in sea whip, as a matter of fact, are known to heal skin irritations due to sunburn, slow down the aging process, and reduce pain and swelling from acne. It also has anti-inflammatory, as the member hinted at, for Bamboo-Town, and healing capabilities. It is essentially the fountain of youth.
Mr. Ferreira adds that historically, the country continues to face the challenge of unlawful harvesting of its biodiversity, given the vast expanse of our territorial waters, particularly when taken into account the existing enforcement capacity.
The current regulatory and institutional setting does not serve us. Thus, we are unable to harness the potential value of our genetic resources and associated traditional knowledge. There is an absence of both a systematic information management system and little coordination between agencies. This is what we meant. Further, many of our existing institutions, which actually issue permits, do not have sufficient resources to actually monitor the permits that they issue. Virtually no institutions receive monetary benefits from research conducted in our country. Virtually none institutions receive monetary benefits from research conducted in our country.
He says once the government recognized the rising number of requests to access the genetic resources found in the Bahamas for research and development use, particularly in our marine waters, he was prompted to enforce an 18-month moratorium on the issuance of research and scientific permits, a moratorium in which Mr. Ferreira says he does not regret.
Because we had to stop the hemorrhaging of our genetic resources and put the regulations and laws in place. That moratorium started in May 2019 and lasted until November 2020. But it's important to note that this was not a ban on scientific research in the country, but this only impacted permit applications which sought to export our genetic resources for the identified period. The 18-month moratorium on research was put in place to limit the unlawful extraction of genetic resources, our genetic resources from our country. This moratorium remains and will remain in effect until the gazetting of this piece of legislation.
When passed, the bill will regulate access to biological resources and associated traditional knowledge. It also will provide the means to ensure sustainable use of the country's genetic resources while prohibiting unlawful genetic and bioprospecting. Minister Ferreira says the act also secures for the country fair and equitable sharing of the benefits arising out of the issue of our biological resources and establishes the very necessary administrative structures and processes for the implementation and enforcement that will come after the bill's passage. He adds that this bill is also a milestone and historic, as it will be the first of its kind in the wider Caribbean to be passed. Now, while the opposition supports the bill, as he says it is timely, Member of Parliament for Exuma and Ragged Island and Deputy Leader of the Progressive Liberal Party, Chester Cooper, says he wishes not to forget that the country's economy is still crumbling.
It is still collapsing at the hands of this administration. And your time is running out. And your fault lines are showing. And we're not seeing any transformative initiatives to bring short or medium-term relief to the Bahamian people. Many are still hungry. Many are still being evicted. Many still can't pay their mortgage. their children's school fees. Many still struggle to find the next meal.
Mr. Cooper insists that Bahamians shouldn't forget the pain the pandemic has inflicted, adding that some of these issues started before the pandemic and before Hurricane Dorian at the hands of the Minnis-led administration.
We are trapped under the thumb of a competent authority that makes decisions based on nothing tangible, it appears, and without the benefit of broad-based consultation. Just this week, we are told that the Melia Resort and Cable Beach is closing for 2 years. The Minister of Tourism was quoted as being blindsided by this. And I must say that this perhaps speaks to the relationship or lack of relationship that this administration is fostering with the key stakeholders, like Bahama and other major stakeholders. Leader of the opposition spoke to some similar concern in his constituency. But in this case, it's the same Bahama you were taking credit of when it was successful.
He says the resort's closure leaves hundreds of people potentially permanently out of work, yet there are emergency orders that allow the employers not to pay their full severance. Mr. Cooper says surely if the investor can find $100 million to invest in the property, it can and must find the severance for those who will be laid off. To that, he says people are concerned, and there are thousands of other Bahamians across the country who find themselves in this most precarious position.
They face their own financial pains as well. With the very basics of life: food, rent, mortgage, school fees, feeding their children. But yet I am concerned that there are even more ridiculous things being said, most recently by the Minister of Labor in his bubble, who talked about unemployment being down drastically, although his director says it ranges still in the 40% range. We don't have the labor force studies. It'll be interesting once these reports are released, which are late, by the way. But I trust that this administration will remove themselves from the bubble and put themselves in the real world.
Mr. Cooper adds if there must be emergency orders, make them make sense. He says after a year and after many changes, enough experience has been gained around the world as to how to deal with certain aspects of the pandemic regarding economic and social stability. He says what the country needs at this time are some reasonable thresholds for triggers as to when businesses will open and close, when schools will open and close. In his opinion, he says that the curfew on no island at this point should begin before midnight. You're watching JCN News. When we return, a National Insurance Board director has been selected and the Red Cross feeds 30,000 households. Stay with us.